we should be off.
Okay.
And we're live. Coroneus Phocis and I will be discussing morality, religion, and gender relations. I came across him on Will Nolan's stream talking about the same subjects. Coroneus, have you any further thoughts since you were talking on Will Nolan's channel?
Yeah, sure. So, Will approached me. I made my YouTube channel and kind of walked through a series of ideas um, from what I would say is core principles of evolution and system optimization up through modern day religion and the impacts of the birth control pill and uh, how the female hierarchy gets created from the male hierarchy and on and on and on. He thought it was interesting and reached out to me, and we kind of went through most of the topics. I think that my primary hypothesis is something to the effect of humans are incipiently eusocial, and that we're taking steps toward full eusociality.
These are new words to me, so I'll have to get you
Yeah,
to explain them. But
sure.
but
So,
but what you said so far, which kind of stopped me in my tracks, was modern day religions. What do you mean by that? You don't mean Christianity. You mean something else, don't you?
well, I have a pretty broad definitional term of religion. So, um, I would say that traditionally religions were the glue that kept societies together and contiguous in their individual elements. They have been somewhat supplanted now by the religion of science is one of them, and then there's also a focus on hedonism and other material wealth, right?
So do
That's
you mean
become its own
secular
religion.
political ideologies like liberalism and
Yeah.
communism and socialism and
So yes,
feminism?
those have we'll say hijacked the underlying circuitry that religion used to run on. I believe that, which is why a lot of the partisanship between the left and the right has become so radicalized, is instead of it being a political layer that lays on top of a healthy societal framework that's running on a same religion, right, substrate, where you can just discuss ideas and disagree about direction. It's becoming a religion into itself, in which the other side is now viewed as evil. And so people are becoming zealots of their ideological religion, and that's why everything's getting so radicalized.
Yeah, because basically we don't even agree on the rules now, and the rules keep
Right.
changing, so nobody's really sure what they are or what they ought to be.
Yeah, and that's one of like the reason that it's like the best way I would describe it is that religion, really the system of morality that usually resides within religion, I'll speak more generally, is like the protocols inside of a networked computer, right? And so you have to know how to interact with other nodes in the societal network. And that's where morality comes in. A moral behavior is a proper interaction between two nodes, and an immoral behavior is an improper interaction. And so when you go and you fundamentally alter the protocols within which the individual nodes interact, whether that's male female interactions or male male interactions or female female interactions, you shift everything about the upper layers of society as well. And so, to your point, you said nobody knows what the rules are, and that's absolutely right. We don't have a shared protocol. What's immoral and moral is no longer agreed upon by the vast majority of society. We actually, there's this idea that morality is subjective, and that's not functional when you have to have nodes interact. You have to have a set protocol for interaction. It has to be decided upon and at least agreed upon by the majority of people.
Yeah, or it has to be official. So what I have now is I'm on this Discord server, the T Jump one, and T Jump has this really weird idea of morality, which he claims is objective morality, and and he's saying that the only objective morality is the morality that doesn't go through anyone's subjective mind, because any okay, I won't even bother explaining it, but basically he's saying, well, everybody's opinion is basically subjective, and so is God's, and therefore he's also wrong. It's that crazy. So,
Yeah, and that's the problem is it's not objective. And so he's trying to be overly objective and forgetting that nature is the ultimate judge. And so it's how do I, the best way to break into this topic is just to realize that if you fundamentally believe in evolution, there are behaviors that are evolutionarily beneficial, and there are behaviors that are not. And
yes.
therefore, there is an objective morality out there because the fitness function, the universal fitness function that governs what traits, whether they're genetic or behavioral, will propagate forward in time, is selecting for an ultimate morality. And my hypothesis is something akin to logos. Um, I can't prove that, but humans definitely have that as a hypothesis built into our structure.
Well,
So,
yes, I mean, I would say that morality is a system of rules designed to keep the group in existence and apart from
right.
others, so that you maintain your identity, whatever it is, so you're not taken
Well,
over by others.
so yes, what I would say is that so that's like, that would be a perfect abstraction of what really goes on. And it's, what would you call it? That would be the theoretical way it would work. In reality, because genetic material can be passed between groups, there aren't really hard lines between groups. They're more blurry at the edges. So over time, there's two components to what this is, and this was the big shift in my mentality. We talk about evolution as being, an optimization engine working on genetic material against a universal fitness function. But people don't really talk about the fact that there's another store of information, to your point, that exists within the morality of a group of individuals that are working together for cooperation, right? My premise is that evolution actually works on that as well. So if you define the group as a subset of genetic material plus a hierarchy over the top, namely a religion or a society, a government, whatever framework you want to put it in, then in order for that its goal is to continue to persist, even though the individual constituent elements, die and cycle through, right? That's the lineage of a civilization. And
So you
so in
can't
that,
ignore marriage. I mean, that is the thing. So if,
correct.
if you
Yep.
mess around with marriage, then the whole thing eventually collapses.
Well, yeah, and
Because marriage is this complicated machinery that all these liberals are basically dismantled, and they have no idea how to put it back again, and now they're saying it doesn't matter
yeah. So marriage is absolutely fundamental to a cooperative society.
because it is
So that,
eugenic, and that's another taboo word
what do
that
you
we're
mean
not
by
to
that?
say. Because marriage, because it has rules. It's saying you're not allowed to have extramarital sex. You're not allowed to have premarital sex. You're not allowed to marry your brother, sister, mother, father, uncle, aunt. That kind of thing. Don't do
Correct.
it. There are rules, and if you do it, you're going to cause degeneracy in your society, and it means you'll just become weak and stupid, and then your enemies and neighbors will come and take you over, and that's the end of you.
Well, that's a fair point. In general, the rules are important. I do want, in order to be intellectually honest, I would say that monogamous marriage is actually genetically dysgenic instead of helpful, right? To
Well,
a
it makes
species.
society stable, because otherwise, if you get the alpha males just hogging all the women, then you'll have
Correct.
all these beta sub beta males, angry and rapey and
Exactly.
criminal.
So marriage is a compromise that stops the genetic evolution of our species towards, more, we would say, better genetic passage. But as a flip, we get rid of what's called the incel problem, right? The involuntary celibate problem, which happens in
Yeah,
most
because
troops.
once upon a time, all bachelors were incels.
Correct. And so, in order to get rid of that, you have a compromise where females are reproductively suppressed and forced, really forced by society to, you'd say, settle for lesser genes than they could otherwise get in a polygamous, hypergamous relationship
Yeah,
or
because we can
setting.
only choose once, right? I mean,
Correct.
that's the idea.
And you lock that male down. So you're really killing alpha male polygamy. And in response to doing that, females have to select farther down the male hierarchy than they would like to. But it works, and it creates much more cooperation amongst the males of the species specifically, and there's not as much pressure for them to revolt and fight and be competitive. That allows for an economy to develop rather than just a chimp troop where the alpha has to constantly beat the other chimps into submission to keep them around. You can only do that to such a high degree of numbers, right? About
It's
50. And after
exhausting.
that,
It's
yeah.
exhausting for a stag, right, or lion, because
Mm-hmm.
he's always been challenged by people who want access to his harem.
Right.
That
And
they
that's
lead
the
very
reason why
short,
we're able to
brutal
cooperate.
lives.
Yeah, and that's the reason why we're able to cooperate the way we do. And that's, if you were to ask me to define humanity, we're something like chimp ants, right? We've been able to be, as a primate, the first cooperative primate. Our focus is to band together to create something bigger than what the individual troop or tribe can create.
Yeah,
And that's
and
civilization.
yes. And the other thing is that we arrange for ourselves to be replaced as we grow old and die, and we make sure,
Correct.
or we try to make sure, that our children are not obviously degenerate and
Correct.
are capable of much less than we are, with fewer
Yeah, in
skills
general,
and that kind of thing.
the orientation of the nuclear, I don't want to say the nuclear family because that's kind of a modern development, but the family unit as a whole being able to reproduce itself and continue its lineage down in support of overall societal goals is the old system, and it worked really well. I mean, it got us from the jungles and the plains, right, into the urban, like it created everything you're looking at was a result of that system. So
But obviously, I mean, the thing I've been trying to make also is that patriarchy was a burden on men too, which explains why all the men that I point this out to when I say restore the patriarchy, they're saying, nah, we're not interested. We'd rather just make do with our masturbation toys and our free porn. Who wants to marry a woman and pay for her kids? Not us. That's basically
yeah.
what I'm getting.
Well, the what's it, the MG Tao movement, the men go their own
Oh,
way.
MGTOW, yes.
Yeah, however you say that.
um,
It's
because you're so
it,
far away from it. But the thing is, yes, it's an understandable reaction to feminism. I get it, but it's not a viable strategy for future survival. Yes, we can understand that because of marriage, the rules of marriage are so unfair that you'd not want to make that bargain, and therefore the solution is to make marriage a better, a fairer bargain for men. And when I proposed that, they weren't interested either because they thought, well, we don't want to marry. We just want to have sex with women. That's all we want. Who wants to marry them?
so yeah. I mean, the issue is that so it's such a new concept for the males of the species to be selective of females, right? That's something that's not seen very much. It's not seen at all in the animal kingdom at all, right? Where men have a selection criteria for women.
Well, it has
Um,
to get lower and lower because, okay, I was talking to this New York guy that was several years ago, and he was saying, he basically said he hoped that, any woman he found to shack up with wouldn't have too horrible a brat that he couldn't bear it. And I thought, hey, come on, that's a very, very low standard. I mean, but I guess that's what men of New York have to put up with these days. That the
well,
woman that they shack up with won't have a brat that is too insufferable.
right. Well, and so the selection criteria that men have is very unsophisticated for women, right? We're really not. It's not very well developed. It's it basically comes down to physical analyses, and that's it. Right?
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
no,
whether they want to have sex with her or not. And,
yeah,
and what I'm kind of saying is that actually, women have control because if we were sluts, us, all of us, you'd have to take us as we come. But if we wanted to be virgin brides, you'd have no choice. You'd have to, you know, up your game to deserve a virgin bride. And I
Correct.
think that, what's the problem now for men is that they don't think they're up to, I don't think they've decided yet, or even acknowledged the problem about,
Well, it's not
women.
it's not for men to solve. Patriarchy was never enforced and maintained by the males of the species. And specifically, we're talking about the fidelitous side of it, right? That was
Yeah, because
always
women would go around calling each other sluts.
correct. That was
It was
always maintained by
self-policing.
the females. Correct.
Yeah, because
Correct.
if everybody, all the local men knew that I was a slut and I walked into the local pub, they'd be rushing to buy me a drink. I imagine. Well, the
Correct.
women would, hiss and spit, but I would, have the
Yeah, and
attention.
I mean, that's the way it was, and so women have always had the power. Women in every species, females of every species, have the ultimate power with
Of
their
selection.
relationship with men. Correct. Yeah, with very rare exceptions, right? There's obviously, rape exists in species, and including the human species, but those are very minority cases. The majority of interactions, females have all the power, and when they don't have the power, it's actually illegal, right? Like, so we've designed the system to be to protect that innate female selective criteria, and
Yeah.
that's the way it's meant to work.
The thing is, a bargain could be made to women because you could say to them, look, you do want to be married mothers at some stage in your life, don't you? And the benefits of patriarchy is that you will have more marriageable men to marry. But, right now, the men will be, gaily married or transgender or just, so terrible you wouldn't even dream of marrying, having sex with them, let alone marry them. So, is this what you want for the future? Maybe you don't want to have children right now, but assuming that you do at some stage, you should be thinking about that, and this is the price you have to pay by, going back to this, patriarchy, slut shaming thing that your ancestors had to do to keep
Yeah,
people under control.
well, and you mentioned a good point. You said that you want men of marriageable material, and in our current system, those are going to become fewer and fewer because a man of
Because there's so many
marriageable
marriage
material.
substitutes. They can be transgender, they can be gay,
Well, it's
it's
not
no
just that.
shame not to be married.
So the type of man that you would consider marriageable material, a patriarch capable of supporting a family and rearing a family, right, has to necessarily be bought into society.
And
And in order to do
affirmative
that,
action legislation repealed and no
well,
fault divorce abolished.
I mean, politically, yes, but more than anything, like young men have to be convinced to leave their basements and reinvest in society. If you look at the college rates and everything, like it's not going well. And so as we move forward and forward, the proportion of males to females that are all bought into society are going to continue to move the wrong way to sustain the needs of marriageable material, to your point. And
Which is why
you know,
the point has to be made now, clearly, because I think a lot of people are not quite saying this, that, really, um, it was a really bad thing when Western nations Western governments stopped supporting the institution of marriage, and that started 50 years ago,
yeah.
we've got 2, 3 generations now of people not caring or valuing the valuing the institution of marriage, or can't even see the point of getting married before having children, because
Well, not until much later. Now it's coming on in their mid 30s when there's not much time left, which is the new crisis, right? Um, there's not much value placed by women on marriage and kids as it used to be in their late teens, early 20s, where that used to be the time where you were looking and thinking about that and arranging your life for that purpose. Now it's been pushed off to mid to late 30s, maybe even early 40s.
and then you'll get a generation who'll be swaddled in cotton wool and neurotic, probably, You know.
Correct. When you only have one child and it's late in life, you tend to treat it as though it's irreplaceable, which it is.
Mm.
But you end up being probably over nurturing. There's a tendency towards that Oedipus, complex with children if it's so precious and irreplaceable. But
So
Claire, I would say in general that the best way to sum up what's going on between men and women right now is that in all the old hero myths, all of them, and even all the old stories, if if you look at the way the stories are set up to explain the motivation of the hero, in every single story, there's a woman at the end of it that's calling the hero forth to save her, right?
yes, a
And
damsel in distress.
correct, whether it's Andromeda with Perseus or it's the lady with King Kong, it doesn't really like every Saint George and the Dragon. There's a virgin in the cave, like in order to call the hero from the crowd, that has to be done by the feminine part of our species. The hero doesn't self motivate, right? If Andromeda is not chained on the rock, Perseus flies on and goes and plays video games in his basement rather than tackling the monster.
Yeah.
So you have to reward positive, and this is just psychology in a mass setting, right? Sociology, really. In order to elicit an investment from the males of the species into the society, you have to create a structure that rewards that positive, like what would you say?
Heterosexual urge that
Yeah,
makes a man desire
this,
sexual access to a woman. Or he
that
wouldn't
should
be
be
doing
the
any of those things anyway, if he were
in the
gay.
construct of a marriage, right? With the intent of producing a family, like that's the goal, right?
Yeah. And all these ideas are basically gone from the minds of most Western men. Completely disappeared with free porn, gay marriage, transgenderism. You know, it's kind of, well, why do we have to do that? We don't want to. Why should we?
Well,
You can't make us.
right.
Unless you
Well, I
change the
mean,
laws, unless you change the laws.
they have a point, right? Like if you risk if you are a successful male, you're making decent money, you have some wealth built up, and you get married. Nowadays, at least in the United States, you're putting quite a big portion of your life's work at risk
If you
based
marry
on
the wrong woman who can divorce you
yeah,
for no good reason at all, which is why no
right.
fault divorce should be abolished. But for some reason, no man is interested, and I think no man is interested because they think, well, I don't want to marry anyway, so I won't marry. So what's a big deal?
Yeah.
But
Well,
it's totally selfish as well. Um,
it's a tough problem, Claire. I would say that to give the devil its due, right? It is possible that the old system will be supplanted by this new system they're creating, and it will work. I don't really see how, but I don't want to come off as so arrogant that I know that this eusocial step we're taking is not functional. It's possible. I don't like it. It's not the way I want to go, but
well,
there are species examples where it's worked. So
well, the thing is, I mean, okay, I don't think the human species is going to um, become extinct, but it will become degenerate. It means that it will be harder for, well, you have 5 daughters, for your, the likelihood of having illegitimate grandchildren, is increased to a great, well,
yeah, the
significant
rates on
extent.
those yeah, the rates on the illegitimacy of children is gone up tremendously. Now there is differences between ethnic groups, right, and subsections of our society.
Yeah.
But as time goes on, that I will say problem gets bigger and bigger. I'm hoping for a reversal, but you never
Well,
know.
you can't get a reversal if nobody says, hey, this is wrong. It's got to stop.
Yeah,
And you were talking about moral systems, okay, non-modern day religions, and all the religions that we've heard of, the world religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, they're all very strict about the patriarchy and the institution of marriage. They know at least they've got to take it seriously.
But yeah, so well, and it's fundamental to being able to organize, right? And like I said,
Yeah.
you can't get over the incel problem and expand your cooperative group past like 50-ish without some sort of sexual suppression across your team, your group, right? That's the way you do it. Is
Yes,
it the
or
only
you'll
way you do
destroy
it?
yourselves, with
Correct. Yeah.
teen
Eventually,
pregnancy and
the
early
mass,
burnout.
yeah, the mass of males that are not bought in reproductively gets to a critical point, and then they just destroy whatever cooperative framework the alpha males have created, right? It does. That's a cycle that would happen, right? And you see it in chimps. Like chimp troops don't get beyond a certain size because there's only so many individuals a single male or maybe two males brothers can maintain. You can't keep that order. So that was the strike up, right? The great bargain that we called for, and that's why it's monogamy is a universal norm across all cultures because it's the way you bridge that gap. Now the question is it the only way? I don't know. I have no idea.
Well, I don't
Um,
see how you can, because I don't know if what kind of school trips you had, but when I did go on them, we were told to pair up with somebody else, so at least you looked after the other person, so you wouldn't get lost and ruin everybody's day with the teacher having to hunt for you because you got lost because you were on your own, kind of thing. And I think the family unit is a kind of idea of you all kind of belong to the state, but we will leave you to organize yourselves into families because this is how you prefer to live anyway. And in the family would be headed by the father, and the father would see to it and have the authority to impose on his wife and children to see that they are being properly parented or whatever. And then you have more biddable children who will become productive members of society, and keep it going. But if everybody's sort of, I don't know, mentally ill or morbidly obese, or a teen mum, bringing up the next generation of criminals, then of course your society is going to go down the tubes. And unfortunately, we're
well,
not
so
allowed to say this anymore, or hardly.
what I would bring up though is, you're there's a lot to unpack from what you just laid out, and I think all of those things are issues. Although the teen mom thing, I'm not so sure. The unwed teen mom is definitely an issue. For the
Oh
majority
yes,
of
yes,
our
that's what I
history,
meant. That's what
yeah,
I meant. I should have said unwed teen mum.
yeah. So for the majority of our history, though, we had children much earlier than we do now. So
Mm-hmm.
like, teen pregnancy, 16, 17, with a partner around the same age was pretty much the norm, right?
Helped by their
Um,
parents,
correct, yeah.
by their
Um, yeah,
extended family. So maybe the
yeah.
nuclear family was a kind of mistake.
And yeah, that's one of the contributing problems, right? So you had three things that happened. The fathers left the home first, right? So traditionally, the fathers were in the home, and there was an apprenticeship that the male children went into, right? Whether it was blacksmithing, farming, whatever their father did, they learned it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was just they were all together, right?
Yeah.
And then the fathers left the home into the distributed economy once the Industrial Revolution really took over, and we needed to move workers around, right? And now the mothers have left the home, and with the fathers leaving the home, you pulled the extended family away because the family unit became nuclear and moved to where they could make money, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak. But to go back, I do want to say that
Um,
I'm trying to be as objective as possible with this. Again, I'm not advocating for this, but to say that there's no way this will work, I think is intellectually dishonest. And I would point to the naked mole rat specifically as a species. They are a eusocial mammalian species with centralized breeding and like a queen, right? Where all of the workers are both male and female, and they're sexually suppressed by hormones secreted by the queen.
mm-hmm.
The workers engage in sterile mounting, right? So they engage in basically what we do now, which is all sterile mating practices, not reproductively viable.
Mm-hmm.
and that satiates their reproductive drive enough to allow them to cooperate in rearing the queen's young with like 3 males that she keeps around. And they work just like any other eusocial species in a cooperative way to expand their territory, and they have different roles, very similar to what we're doing without the centralized reproduction.
What do you mean by eusocial? That's a new word for me.
Yeah, so eusocial is a category of behaviors among species where you have highly cooperative groups, right? And its hallmark is something like ants or bees, or there's also shrimp that are eusocial, as well as, like I mentioned, the naked mole rat, where they have centralized breeding and reproduction into one or a few individuals, and then group rearing of those young, where they're all sisters, right? Like ants are all sisters rearing the young of the queen. Uh, and by doing that, you gain a lot of cooperation amongst your individuals because they can't reproduce themselves. They're forced evolutionarily to focus on what's called inclusive fitness because 75% of their genes are contained within the queen. They get an evolutionary inclusive fitness bump by helping the queen to rear her young. And if you look at what we're doing as a species, we have centralized rearing already in daycares and public school systems, et cetera. The only thing, and we have highly cooperative societies, only thing we're really missing is the centralized reproduction. And the way we've gotten to this point, away from the monogamous framework, was through hormonal suppression of the reproductive capabilities of females through the birth control pill, et cetera, that's allowed us to transition them from a reproductive role into a worker role, very similar to how ants do. Um, if we were to create technology in a similar vein that would allow us, like artificial wombs, to breed ourselves in a centralized way, we would be by definition eusocial at that point, which is probably 20 years off ish from early stages. So again, I don't want to discount that this is a stable evolutionary platform. Like other species have gotten to this point, we're headed that direction. I don't personally want to be part of some sort of hive. Like I much rather prefer the family unit to govern and just to keep a monogamous framework over the top of everything. I think it worked very well. I think we do not know what will happen if we continue down this trek. And so it's very, we're running a huge sociological experiment without having any idea what the end result's going to be. And
What
that's
what was
scary.
what was that animal that you said? That
The
doesn't.
naked mole rat.
What's that? It's a shrimp.
No. The naked morat is a man. It's a mammal. It's in Africa, and it's a eusocial. It's the only currently known eusocial mammalian species. So, and
How do you spell
you
the
said, yeah,
name of this animal?
the naked mole rat. I know it's got a weird
Mole
name though. But
rat. Mole rat.
yeah, mole rat. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you haven't looked it up, and if in your audience, it is the most fascinating. It's fascinating for a bunch of different reasons. First off, its skin is like super resistant to acidity, and it's like tough because it lives in a 70% CO2 environment its whole life because they just live underground. Um, and it's just a really interesting species. We think of
It's
colony
ugly.
type.
It's so ugly.
Yeah, it is. But we think of colonial species, eusocial species, right? As ants and bees, where you have the queen and workers and drones and all this other stuff. But in reality, there's a vast plethora of species that have gone down that route. And as soon as you start to dig into what eusociality represents and how it was developed, you start to see the similarities of how humans have organized themselves. And we just have a couple steps left to take, and we're fully there. And that's the direction we're headed, which is, you know, and when you look at that and you say, all right, well, project out what humans are going to be like 100 years from now. If I was going to do that, I would say on our current trajectory, we'll look more like the naked mole rat, not physically, but in societal organization, or bees or ants than chimps, right?
Right. Well, I'm going to use that as the thumbnail of this video.
Yeah, it's a fascinating species. Like, um, they're just the weirdest thing ever. Like there are species that shouldn't exist, because we've categorized that whole colonial style of development into insects basically, right? And it's not that way. It's actually a stable behavioral pattern cross species, right? So,
Well, it's not much of a future to look forward
well,
to, is it?
right. And no, it's not. And you have to, like,
Should we
the
fight it a little bit, rather than agree to evolve or devolve into this naked mole rat species thing? I mean,
well, I don't think
did
we're
we
not going
owe
to
it to
do.
ourselves as being human to fight it just a little bit?
I don't know so yeah, I think that the correct way to push back against this isn't so much rhetoric or political action. It actually starts with the individual. I think that in general, the only person that you can actually change in a healthy way is yourself. Forcing change upon others never works out in the long term.
Well, I
So
suppose you've got to formulate the desire to change in yourself, and then when you've changed, yeah, then you think, well, maybe I can, persuade a few others to,
you can persuade,
yeah,
correct? Yeah,
yeah.
but the best way to persuade, and this is something that goes back to something I was taught when I was in the military, is leading by example, right? Because if you're not aligned yourself to the principles that you are espousing, and you're not a model member of those tenets, when you go to invoke the authority of those tenets through speech on someone else and say, hey, this is the moral way, their response, rightly so, will be like, well, you're not doing that. How the hell do you know, right? So you have to be, again, the only person that you can actually control is yourself. So aligning you as a node in society to vibrate correctly, let's say, in a moral way, in the proper framework, and then passing those tenets on to your immediate surrounding as best you can is the path forward.
But are you saying that, therefore, that unless you're married with legitimate children, you have no right to pronounce on these things or even discuss these
No, I
subjects?
don't think you can't discuss them. It's not about being able to discuss them, right?
But
Because you
people say,
should,
oh, but you're not married.
yeah, it cuts down against your credibility. So, I mean, what's one of the tenets that's in the New Testament is like they'll know you by your works, right? So, and what that basically implies is that um, the best the best way to convince somebody that your method of being is the proper method of being is to be successful with that method of being. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, I'm going to use a lower standard saying, which is that we can only submit to truth, logic, and morality, and if truth, logic, and morality tells us that bringing up the next generation is better, if it's better for the next generation if they're brought up by their two married biological parents living together in a loving relationship, then that's what we should do, rather
Correct.
than do this gay marriage, transgenderism, and shacking up thing.
Yeah, I don't think you advocate for any of that, right? I mean, it's hard to say with the gay marriage thing. I'm a little torn on it because there is a that one specifically. I'm not sure that you would call it. I have issues calling it marriage because marriage does imply reproductive capability,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But you do need an offshoot for a subset of males in your species to keep them satisfied,
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah. So you wouldn't exactly ban
No,
couples from
no,
living together. Of course not.
correct,
But you kind of have to make it clear that married parents have a higher status than non-parents and unmarried parents,
well,
and somehow you convey that message, and I think things should be all right.
I don't know if so the status that I would focus on. I'm not sure if it's a status. It's really like as a society, you should make sure that the laws around like taxation breaks for married couples
Mm,
are focused on incentivizing rearing the next generation,
mm.
right? And that's really the point of those. So if you're not doing that,
People won't
then you
be
shouldn't.
incentivized and they won't do it, even though
Correct.
you can say all kinds of
Yeah.
things about it. but I
Yeah,
think
that's kind of where I would land.
yeah, and I think equal pay will have to go because
What do you
that
mean?
well because it's part of the affirmative action legislation that makes men and women compete against each other rather than complement each other.
I'm not sure so I don't think that the equal pay movement is false in its premise, and it won't go anywhere because there's nothing to change. So I mean, they can pass all the laws they want that mandate equal pay, but the reality is, as soon as you measure the pay accordingly, there's no part of the gender pay gap, which is just a macro univariate like measure of the delta between the average male salary and the average female salary. Once you break that down into more stratification levels, gender's not a contributor to that delta.
I'm
There's no
afraid I don't
bias.
understand that at all. Sorry.
Oh, so the implication of the gender pay gap rhetoric is that the reason for the 75 cents to a dollar or 82, whatever the new number is, right, to a dollar, is that it's all based on some sort of gender bias, right? That there's some sort of bias in the overall system that selects against higher salaries for women and it selects for higher salaries for men. And that's not true. It's more has to do with um, how the groups of male and female naturally organize themselves towards different um, types of jobs. And so,
Mm-hmm.
because of that, supply and demand in the economy um, dictates the pay for those job types. As an example, men make up the majority of engineers, and
Mm-hmm.
women make up the majority of nurses. And
Mm-hmm.
those roles, because of their scalability specifically and their economic utility from scalability, get paid differently. And so it's not a bias in the salary. As a matter of fact, women in their 20s to 30s make more on average than men. It's only because of dropout from pregnancy and wanting to be a mom that
Mm-hmm.
the gap widens later in life. So
Yeah, and there's
there's
a
no way
preference
to.
that for people to want their firefighters to be male and their nurses to be female.
Well, I'm not sure if it's even market driven. It's more supply driven, right? So
Mm.
there's a demand component for sure, but the matriculation of the individuals through those disciplines um, is based on how they sort themselves going in, and it's the aspiration of young people wanting to go into certain fields, right? And you can't really change that. Like, well, you can, but you're going to be forcing people in a tyrannical way to choose things they don't really want to do, and that's not what we really want. And that's why I don't think that any of the gender pay, like, there's nobody who understands math in any great degree thinks the gender pay gap's a real problem. It's just not. Like, there's
Would
no.
it make it harder for women to find a man who can um, afford to support a family on just one salary? That would, you know, interfere with the ability of this woman to find such a man.
Well, when females entered the workforce in mass, we effectively doubled the supply of labor, which is going to have a net negative impact on average wages, right?
There
And
used to
that's just.
be the presumption that well, in the UK anyway, I didn't. I know it's historic, but anyway, a woman once married would be assumed to be leaving her job. That was what it was in the olden days. And I
Yeah.
thought that was quite interesting because they were really focused at the time on being allowing men to well creating men that would be considered marriageable, you know, by any standards, I suppose. And oh yes, and talking about equal pay, I've heard it said, I don't know for a fact, that female porn actresses get paid more than male porn actors. I think
Well, of course.
this must be true, even though I suppose technically the male does more.
It's just a political talking point, is all it is. It's not a real economic problem, and the real reason that the high. So the reason that high status women from an economic sense are having trouble finding men of equal stature is because uh, we're men do not evaluate women that way. So it,
Men have
there,
lower standards and women have higher standards.
well, it's not that our standards are completely different. So,
Yes, your
there's an
criteria
impl
are completely different.
correct, yeah.
Mm.
So, the implication is that that males evaluate females in the exact same way that females evaluate males, and that's just simply not true. And it won't ever be true.
Yes, because I think
So
males would prefer women to be from a lower social class than they are, or at least the same. Well, women just want, higher
that's
status
what the
males.
that's what the pair bonding data seems to suggest is that men date across and down, and women date across and up on the hierarchies, right? So when you're at and that's the other thing is the implication that the top of the female hierarchy is some graded socioeconomic hierarchy is not true at all. Like the top of the female hierarchy has nothing to do with productive output, education level, or type of job or income, right? Like the top of the female hierarchy is primarily two things. It's selectivity and it's beauty. And those two things are what males are forcing into the female hierarchy. So
What do you mean by selectivity? Being a virgin?
yeah, yeah. So well, okay. So if you have you have to go back to hypergamous and polygamous like species, right? In those species, there is no such thing as a female hierarchy, right? Females do not actively compete like males compete for reproductive access, um, because
They
there's no
derive
law.
their status from their father or husband.
No, let's not talk that's societal monogamy. So let's go back before that, right? Before that was implemented. So um, think like birds. Birds are a good example. Think like any other species, basically deer, elk, doesn't matter, right? Males are not bound to mating only one female, and so because of that, there's no inter-female competition for the best male. They can share him, right? Because there's actually no pair bonding. There's no fathering. There's none of that exists, right? And so in that subsection of species, the only hierarchy that really exists is a male hierarchy. And that's why you see antlers develop and then the deer fight each other for access to females. And then the females pick the best deer from the lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
To explain the female hierarchy, you have to impose monogamy. And once you impose monogamy, you force females to stop sharing the top males, and again you force them to pick across into the male hierarchy at lower levels, and they wouldn't actually do that. And what that does is it actually creates a female hierarchy that's now responding to male selection, because for the first time ever in our species, when we put monogamy in, males are actually selecting females for marriage, which is completely new, right? Normally females select males. Now we have counter selection of males to females. When you do that, you create a female hierarchy. But because it's not been optimized for 2 billion years of evolution, it's very rudimentary. So, how do males select females? Males select females along basically three traits. One's fertility, which is going to be defined basically as beauty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's physical appearance.
And
The
youth?
second's nurture. What?
Beauty and youth.
Yes, exactly, because that's fertility primarily, right? The second's going to be some sort of nurturing, right? So not only do you need to be able to have children, you need to be able to rear them correctly. So we're not gonna look for overly aggressive, and that's really it's the aggressive versus nurturing that we're looking for, right? And then the third one is some selectivity, and what I mean by that is because the male side of there's two components, but because the male side is very, we'll say, unsophisticated because it's not been optimized for a very long time, like the female side has for reverse selection, we imply a lot of a female's worth, let's say, our female's position in the hierarchy based on the males she selects for, because her selection is going to be across and up, and it's very sophisticated. It implies a relative ranking amongst the female hierarchy. So the more selective a female is, the higher up on the female hierarchy she is by default. Does that make sense?
Can you give an example of this?
Sure. So the best example is in the best female hero myth that we have, which isn't fully explored. but is in the Virgin Mary, right? So she is so selective of the father of her future offspring that no mortal man is good enough, and only God is. That would be the ultimate selective. And then if you look at that story and emulated in modern media, that's something akin to Belle in Beauty and the Beast. So Gaston is the best man in town, right? But she sees through his, I don't know what you call it, like,
his chauvinism and his
yeah,
sexism
yeah,
and
yeah.
his
Yeah, she sees through all that bravado and is looking for something else. It's not that surface, and what she's looking for in that story is really logos. It's the ability. The reason that she selects the beast ultimately is that the beast can see the monster he is in the mirror, whereas Gaston cannot. So the beast has the ability to self-reflect and change. Gaston is stagnant and vain and cannot self-reflect and change. So something like
well,
that
the
is
beast
what
was
you look at.
originally a prince, wasn't he?
Yes, yeah, but he's able to see the monster that he's become, right? And not to dwell too much on that, but that's kind of what I'm driving at is the ultimate part of the female hierarchy is selective, and that also implies fidelity, right? Because if you're highly selective, you're fidelitous to your selection as well.
Yes,
So
yes, yes. And the
uh,
other thing,
that makes sense, though, right?
yes,
Yeah.
and also I don't know how much you would agree with this, but I think women would um, regard the political views of their men as one of the more important things to think about. Well,
Yeah.
because they think, oh, but he's, oh, I don't know, a fascist, a Nazi, oh, better avoid him, even though he's quite handsome. They might think that. While men, because they don't take seriously a woman's intellect, will say, oh, she's a bit silly, but, I'll just ignore, her silly political views.
Um, yeah, well, I think in general you're right. Men are much less selective than women, and
Yes.
that's just because, like I said, it's we haven't been doing it in series for as many centuries, millennia,
Yes,
right?
and that would be
So
okay if you were in control of politics and the rules and the law and everything, and and you can afford to ignore the silly views of women, but not the other way around, I guess.
that's a tough thing. I'm not sure.
Because currently what's happening is that um, um, the feminist narrative is that men are brutal exploiters of women who randomly kill women because they are misogynists and more inclined to violence, and therefore women need to be protected from them, and that's why you get more and more laws to protect more and more women who will be using those rules to um, use against men, like Judge Kavanaugh and people like that. When you think, well, a historic sexual offence can easily be made up and used as something to destroy a man's reputation and career with um, no challenge really, no resistance.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the guilty until proven innocent perspective that we tend to be going down in the West nowadays. I do prefer the innocent until proven guilty
Yeah,
route.
yeah, and the thing was, if you had been following, I forget, is it Deuteronomy 17:15, the one that says, no man shall be convicted on the testimony of just one person, um,
Yeah,
that
that's
would
an
that
old.
would protect you, but since everybody's an atheist now, I guess he didn't have the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, it's interesting. As an ex-atheist, I guess they're an interesting lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these laws were clearly intended to protect the patriarchy and also protect women as well. But unfortunately, so many English words have been changed. Marriage is now equated with patriarchy, which is equated with domestic violence. But to even steelman their position would be to You say, okay, if most women had to live in the homes of their fathers or husbands, and if they suffered violence, it would probably, it'd be most likely to be from, the male members of the family than the female members of the family. But um, but if it were the other way around, if we lived in a matriarchy where, incidents of criminality would be more common, then the female would be more in danger of male violence from non-members, from men who are not their fathers and not their brothers or their husbands, which is worse. It's probably quite hard to decide, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm not sure what a matriarchy looks like even.
Okay, it's my thesis that we already live in one because I define patriarchy as a society that prioritizes the preferences of married parents who want to properly parent their legitimate offspring. And I define matriarchy as a society prioritizing the preferences of unmarried parents who casually conceived and parented their illegitimate offspring.
Hmm. Well, so that then that would make the matriarchy equivalent with a hypergamous polygamous setup to begin with. So, um, which I mean, I guess is relatively true. I can see the mirror there. Sure.
But I mean, the additional danger is that such a society will have no accountability at all because you may have a male national leader nominally in charge, like Biden or Trump, but they're not really in charge. So if you ask them to do anything, they can't do it because there are, people behind the scenes controlling, or they just can't get anything done. And I think in the summer there was some military people talking about, we want a clear command structure because, we can't, carry on like this. And the benefits of a clear structure of command is that you know who's issuing the orders, you know who didn't follow orders, and you can identify the weakest link, and it's crucial for military organization to work in that way because if it was egalitarian then nobody would be the one risking their lives to attack, ambush, whatever, because they'll be saying no, you go and attack that the enemy, you go first, because why should I, and then nothing would be done and the enemy would come and get you and that would be the end of your society. But matriarchy, it's like, oh, we're all equal, so nobody really listens to anybody, and nothing gets done, and all problems are well, the buck is passed. And I know Truman said as long ago as the 50s that the buck stopped, in the Oval Office, but it didn't.
Yeah, I think, and he was talking about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if I remember correctly. Um,
Oh, was he? I wasn't even sure what he talked about. I only discovered he was the one who said it. But, um, but
I think he was responding to his decision to drop the bombs. There was some pushback, and he said, "No, the buck stops here." If I may be misremembering this, but I'm pretty sure that
I'll,
what
I'll,
they were
I'll look
talking
it
about.
up. But I suppose, generally speaking, it's a statement of accountability.
Yeah.
And
Well, he can't. That's the one thing that I think is important about the systems that we've set up in the West originally, was that the reason we went, monarchy has its benefit, I guess. It has its pros, but it also has a lot of cons in that, one or two bad leaders can really destroy a civilization. And so when you make the top of your hierarchy politically impotent, right, to where they can't really change, then what you're relying on is the social fabric to be properly oriented towards the goal, right? And and that works really well when the social fabric is healthy. And that's the basis of a republic or a democracy. Is it only functions if the social fabric's healthy. If the social fabric is not healthy and strong and has vitality in it, then it's going to drift just like it is now into these really partisan, radical, you know, issues.
yeah,
I would say that, monarchy might solve that problem, but it's not an optimal solution. What we really need to do, in my opinion, is reinvigorate the social fabric.
Well, when you say monarchy, I think you mean, a strong leader, and I can see, um,
Power
well,
residing in one or a small group of people, right?
because I see, okay, mm, I, I guess I kind of want to make a point about the difference between an absolute dictator and a constitutional dictator. Because an
Okay.
absolute monarch is basically saying, whatever I say goes, and I don't have to, follow any rule. But a constitutional dictator will, well, I would say, he's like a caliph, because the Muslims talk about their caliphate, and they're saying, oh, well, our caliph is so wonderful, and the moment he governs against Islamic principles is when we get rid of him. So we know, he can only do things within, the bounds of Islam, and that kind
Sure.
of thing. And the thing about human history is that, well, it was the American Republic that rejected monarchy. I mean, that was just so clear in the Declaration of Independence, and also the other thing that it rejected was Christianity, and that was confirmed really in the French Revolution, which did the same thing. And therefore, this move away from Christianity of Europeans, was a process that started, well, about 200 years ago. And I think it's finally, reaching the point when it's like, here, this is where we are. But the thing started a long time ago. I mean, some of us might want to blame it on the swinging '60s, and um, but I think it was a slow process of Westerners rejecting their religion, because it had caused so much, well, problems for them before. Because I don't think that there's any other continent that had a European war of religions, the way Europeans did. And you talk to Europeans, and it's like they don't care, they don't know what it was about, they don't want to talk about it. But then, the entire history is moving away from Christianity.
Yeah, there's no doubt that we are moving away from Christianity as a society, right? As a civilization. So, um,
But,
I
but in
think
a
there's
way,
a,
it's natural, because when people are now finally asked about what Christianity means, um, they find it hard to believe. And I'm sure lots of people who were burnt at the stake, who for denying the divinity of Jesus, well, they found it hard to believe, and they questioned it, and that was the only way Christians could keep control, or Christian governments could keep control, which was absolutely ruthless suppression of people's freedom of belief, until the American Republic and its First Amendment.
well, that's right. That's pretty. I would say that the Christian suppression of heretical behavior, right, um, is just. I think that's pretty standard for theocratic uh, organizations. Um,
I don't think it happened, in say China. Okay, there were probably,
no, it did not. I don't think
because it's like,
it was ever theocratic.
yeah, because the Chinese have this system of Chinese ancestor worship, and even now, for the people who practice it, I mean, they say, no, we don't know if it's really true or not, but we do it because we're Chinese. It's an expression of being Chinese, but who knows, if it's really true. But the whole process, the whole ritual. So it's only an expression of their identity. But the whole idea of it is really to protect the patriarchy, make Chinese, well, married couples have lots of sons, so that they could become the cannon fodder for Imperial China, for its, well, its imperial wars. So
Right.
that presumably was the purpose of having lots of men, and probably to increase the likelihood of being able to fight successive defensive wars, because there will always be predatory nations who want to attack you and take you over, and
Well, there will, and there's, I'm not, again, there's a political layer to some of this, and then there's a deeper layer about societal fabric, right? Um, the organization of the government is important, but I don't think it's as important as the societal fabric that creates that organization of the government on top of it. That does that make sense?
I don't know. It sounds like chicken uh, and egg. I suppose what we want is that maybe we can agree that we need laws to control us. Whether we believe in God or not, we kind of see the point of laws to limit our immorality and to discourage undesirable behavior, even though we might not agree about what is desirable or undesirable behavior. But obviously the best kind of laws would be backed by divine authority, because that would make it more likely for people to obey it for longer, and without questioning its authority.
Yes, but again, I don't know that the obeying of laws. So, a law is a prescriptive punishment for immoral behavior
Mm-hmm.
defined by a state, right? In reality, laws never tell you what moral behavior is. They just tell you the things you can't do. And so, similar to how the Old Testament kind of, framed up for the majority of its books the immoral behavior that was banned, there's a counterpart question of, well, how should I act? Not how shouldn't I act, but how should I act? That needs to be answered. And the state can't do that for you, right? You can't create laws about how you should act. And so because of that, um, I think that's where I diverge from the idea that the state can impose a system of morality that's complete. It can only define immorality. It can't define morality. That has to be done in a social fabric, religious way, and it has to be inculcated into the next generation by the current generation in a
In
distributed way.
families,
Correct.
right, it can only be
Yeah.
because something becomes sacred because it's been around for a long time, and then people won't question it.
Exactly. And there's logic behind all of the moral frameworks of Christianity, of Judaism, of even Islam. And I think that one of the things that happened during the Enlightenment in Europe was that the intellectual class asked the question of the social fabric. It's like, why are we doing this? And the social fabric could not articulate it beyond because God says so, right? And then the intellectual class rejected that as a sufficient answer because of their objective view of reality. And I think that there are objective reasons why most of these rules and patterns and behaviors are classified as moral in these frameworks. And they just need to be explained in the appropriate terms objectively, and then they can be respond that those questions can be answered. Does that make sense?
um, I think Nietzsche said in the 1870s this infamous thing that he said about, he said that God is dead and we have killed him. He said that in the
Yep.
1870s, and um, I think he was expressing um, concern that most people, even then in the 1870s, after German unification, that there seemed to be a lot of disbelief in God, and I know there was what they call the Kulturkampf, the culture war, when the newly unified German state was basically telling the Catholics that the Catholic Church. Where that to basically sling its hook and say, well, keep your nose out of our business. The future is liberal and the past is Catholic, and we're not putting up with your nonsense anymore. And I think that was the beginning, and that's why that was why Nietzsche said and he was worried that disbelief in the Trinity would eventually lead to, well, immorality and maybe what's happening now. because he was saying, well, if you don't believe the whole moral basis of your society, then you will begin to eventually not obey it, and bad things will follow for not obeying the most
Yeah.
important rule of all, which is marriage.
Well, he in what book was it? Will to Power, I want to say. Um, he specifically said probably the most profound thing for me of his set of ideas, and it was that we don't really care which set of beliefs are objectively true. We only care how those beliefs, when held by an individual, impact that individual or society's life giving, life preserving, and life rearing traits. So it's like an evolutionary lens on belief, right? It doesn't matter if it's objectively true or not. What matters is holding that belief, what are you compelled to do, and what's the outcome long term of you and everyone else being compelled down that path. It's all
Yes,
psychology.
yes, and I think fundamentally it is really the building blocks of society, and I mean by that gender relations, and marriage is the regulator of gender relations. And if that thing goes wrong, then everything else will go wrong as well. Because the battlefield of the war of the sexes is fought on the battlefields of marriage, really. And the rules have got to be fair enough, or everything will go wrong. I mean, the whole idea of the yin and yang is also an acknowledgement of this, I guess, the eternal battle of the sexes. So, it's got to be just right, because if it isn't, there will be, nasty revenge from women to men, or from men to women, and, so we kind of have to watch it and not exploit our temporary power over the other sex, if we are fortunate enough to enjoy it. And the other
Yeah,
thing, difficulty is that, if the law allows us to do the particular thing, then we think that we are well within our rights to do it, because, there's no law against it. And if the law allows us to exploit our advantage, then many people will. And if the law is wrong, then, well, then bad things will follow.
just because something's legal doesn't make it moral.
Yes. And so this goes back to the problem of choosing which moral system. We know, because there are quite a few competing ones to choose from, and there must be a rational way of choosing the best one. And then now we go back to the Judeo-Christian heritage of the West. I mean, there was this idea of, well, if we're going to choose a religion, we're going to choose a god, we're going to choose the most powerful god, and that will be the Abrahamic God. And
Well, it
it seems
depends
to
on
have
what you want
stood
to
the
put
Jews well, because they're still around, after
it. Yeah, I
six
mean,
thousand years. So
it has worked, and they seem to be a contiguous group with a strong tradition. And same thing with Islam, right? I think the implication that you're making is that Christianity is not part of the realm of the Abrahamic God.
well, no, it is, because the whole belief system of Christianity is predicated on the existence of Jews. So the three of them are linked. Um,
So I wasn't
in a
going to
sort of
necessarily
Hegelian
disagree with you, by
thesis,
the way.
antithesis, synthesis kind of thing.
Yeah, but I wasn't going to disagree with you in that, the God in Islam and Judaism is definitely the same God. He has the same characteristics, and to your point, is something akin to pure power, right? Omnipotence is really the trait that we're looking at there. Um, because of the Trinitarian notion inside of Christianity, and specifically Jesus's character traits, right? Which is his character traits are very unique among, with the only real relative similarity in Buddha, right, from the East. Um, the mode of being that Jesus demonstrated as ideal has really little to do with power. It's actually much more to do with love and responsibility. And I find that a compelling notion, and it's especially the idea of self-sacrifice um, pervades or it's so pervasive across our subconscious that, you ask the question, how do I make the world better? The answer, and it's even, it's part of Judaism as well in the Old Testament. How do you make tomorrow better? How do you get blessings from God? Sacrifice, right?
Well, you
What's the
know,
goal?
you need to know what he expects of you, but that is the thing.
Well,
And
what
you
I'm
can
talking about
only
is the
understand
fundamental.
God through his laws.
Yeah, but that's, again, you're talking about the negative side. So the laws is given by, the Ten Commandments and Deuteronomy, etc. Those are prescriptive laws against certain behavior. And the question still needs to be asked, well, I know the things that I can't do, right? What is the best thing that I can do? And that's not really fully answered. You could say Joshua in the Old Testament kind of answers this question, but Jesus answers it completely in the New Testament.
Maybe you
Um,
could explain to me how you thought Joshua answered the question. I'm a
well,
little vague.
he's kind of the prototype on which Jesus is built-ish, right? Um, the component that was missing from Joshua's story completely, that was fully articulated in the story of Christ, is the self-sacrificial motif, and it answers the question, right, that was posed in the story of Cain and Abel in the beginning in Genesis, right? And I would say
I
that,
don't quite see. I think you'll
sure, yeah.
explain
So,
the connection.
well, the question that's posed in Cain and Abel is, why was Cain's sacrifice rejected by God while Abel's was accepted? In other words, why did God shower blessings upon Abel and then not upon Cain? And it's never fully answered. So in Genesis, the answer given is something like, if you do well, will you not be rewarded, right? So the implication is that Cain, even though he was sacrificing, wasn't sacrificing correctly, right? While Abel was. So if you fast forward, it's like, all right, well, how do you sacrifice correctly? That's the question that's posed. And it's not answered. I mean, there's rules about the things you're supposed to sacrifice for things that you do wrong, and et cetera. But there's not this full articulation of the concept of sacrifice, and how it's best done. So if you think about, all right, just think about your personal life, Claire. How do okay, how do you make tomorrow better than today? And the answer is, you sacrifice today via work for tomorrow, meaning you work today and put off things that you want to do to make your future better, right? And I
Postponed
think,
pleasure, postponed
correct.
gratification.
And, and you do that process with faith, because you have to have faith that the future will reward you for that work you're investing today, right? If you don't have that faith, you're likely to sacrifice too little of your time today for tomorrow, right? And these things become um, small. It's like exponential addition, right? The more you sacrifice, the better tomorrow gets, the better the next day gets, the better the next day gets, right? And so if you take that to its extreme, right, and that's a very personal level, right? So what's the proper way to sacrifice your now? Like, so there's multiple different ways you could sacrifice. You could clean your room up, to quote Peterson. You could work on learning something else, right? You could work on, creating
Or
more.
maybe just refraining from being too mean to the people
Sure,
around you.
absolutely.
That's also a kind of
So then the question is, what's the best way to sacrifice today? What's your orientation? What should be your orientation in life? And the answer that the New Testament proposes is Christ, meaning you should take everything about yourself and make it subservient to your responsibility for humanity and sacrifice everything in pursuit of saving humanity. That's the mode of being you should
it
adopt.
sounds rather a tall order and very
It's
vague.
extremely tall order. And it's such a tall order that I can't imagine being able to do it. And that's why it's aspirational. I can't imagine being so aligned internally that as my persecutors, society at large, nail me to a cross, I ask Father in heaven to forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. I can't imagine being that emotionally aligned towards that goal. It's
You do know
beyond
that
comprehension.
you do know that the Quran says Jesus didn't die on the cross. I don't know if you are aware. I mean, the Quran does acknowledge Jesus as a prophet of God and also the virgin birth, which I found surprising when I discovered that. But that's a narrative anyway, you know, and Muslims,
Well,
you know, do
but think,
respect
I mean,
Jesus.
so let me ask you this question. Which narrative framework is more powerful at demonstrating an ideal? The one in which he does die on the cross? And if you think about what
Well,
the
it is
implication is,
certainly a greater sacrifice, but then if the upshot of that is that it causes lots of people to practice idolatry, which is forbidden in the Ten Commandments, then it becomes problematic.
well, again, it depends on your definition of idolatry, but just comparing the two narrative versions of Christ's life, right? One in which he does die and sacrifices everything about himself to save humanity from its own sin, and we'll define sin as being morally off target, right? Which would include the crucifixion himself, right? Um, versus the narrative where he comes to teach and does not die. So he doesn't take that ultimate step, laying everything on the line for that. I find the Christian telling of that to be much more elaborative of the ideal.
But
Now, again, I think it's an abstraction that is almost impossible to attain, but that's the point. That's the point. Just like the virgin birth is impossible to attain,
well,
but that's
it
the
sounds
point.
like a kind of, well, I think in theory it's possible. I mean, I think even a non-human species, but I suppose, you know, artificial insemination would be possible in a virgin. Um, um, but I think for for the narrative whether Jesus died on the cross or not, it seems to me that you know Islam is saying, you know, we don't hate Jesus. We know the Jews do, and they've been saying mean things about Jesus, about, you know, his father being really a Roman soldier and that kind of thing. But you know, Muslims sort of make a point of saying we accept the story of the virgin birth, and we also regard Jesus as a prophet of God. But of course, you know, Muhammad is the last prophet because the Quran is the final word of God on the whole matter about how we should lead our lives. And and so I suppose, you know, if you are worried about, oh, you know, idolatry, it's a bad thing, and Jews get the death penalty if they're caught, you know, if they're convicted of idolatry or blasphemy, then obviously it's a big deal for Jews, and Muslims say don't do it too, but there are no this life punishments as far as the Quran is concerned. Um, so
So, Claire, just so I understand where you're going with this, I think that you're focusing the idolatry on the distinction of God into three separate parts that includes Jesus. Is that what
the
you're calling idolatry?
Trinity, yes, the
Yeah.
Trinity. We are
And then
talking
you could
about the
also
Trinity.
probably argue that the Catholic Church's view on Mary is would also classify as idolatry.
Because they
Is that what
call her
you're
Mary, Holy Mary, Mother of God.
correct? Yeah, okay. Um, so look,
But the thing is, we
so
have to remember that Jesus was convicted of blasphemy. So that's
no,
another thing to.
fair. No, I acknowledge all that. So from a look from the Old Testament specifically and Judaism by itself, all everything you're saying is technically true, right? But again, you're arguing from the frame of a single religion rather than pulling out of all religions and looking at them objectively about how they're going to, again, to Nietzsche's notion, how the beliefs, when held by the society, are going to impact behavior, especially towards life-giving, life-rearing, life-preserving actions. And so I think arguing within the framework of Judaism or Islam against Christianity misses the point that I'm making. I'm not arguing from within Christianity that it is perfect, nor is it the proper continuation of Judaism. I'm looking at the aspirational mode of being of Christ as explained in the New Testament and saying, I see nothing that is objectively better to orient yourself to than that mode of being as laid out in the New Testament, specifically the Gospels. And the more I dig at that, especially the implication of John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, that statement there is probably the most profound statement in any book ever written. And I
What does
just,
that mean?
yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know that we have time to
Oh,
break into logos and
yes.
the philosophy of logos, but I will tell you that intro to John, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, is echoed in the Quran as well. You know, God spoke forth being, I think, I forget, I'm going to misquote it, but something like, let it be, right? Um, what Allah said to create the world, right? Um, and it's in the
It
Genesis as
sounds like
well, you
make
know.
it so in Star Trek.
Yeah, and you know, I'm not as spun up on the Quran as I probably should be to be able to quote it directly, but I do
Uh,
believe that in the creation telling that God uttered words to create the world, right? To create the universe. And I believe the words are something like "let it be." I could look it up, but um,
uh-huh. I mean, please tell me what you discover when you do look it up. I mean, I'll, it seems to me that John is saying, God is an idea, obviously a very big idea that, created the universe, has a theory of everything, and is there to sort of tantalize us into, rejection or acceptance. Because,
well, the fundamental notion of John is that when you dig into it, you think through the implication of what he's saying. You have to define what a word is, right? What is a word?
it's
And,
an
and a word
idea.
is
Every word is a representation of an idea.
it's a conceptualization that's focused on utility, right? Words do not exist in our collective consciousness that have no utility. So it's a shared understanding of some sort of ordered chaos that we can interact with for shared utility or individual utility. And as an example, like the word blue, right, is a concept of color. It's a wavelength that we perceive via our eyes, right? Um, there are tribes, specifically in Africa, that have no word for blue. And the reason they have no word, and once they have no word for it, they can't perceive blue. So you can't communicate with them about the color blue. And the reason they have no word for it is they've never had seen utility in the differentiation of blue from other colors, right? Because there were no plants that were blue around them, and only the sky was blue, and that was just backdrop, right? There was no utility in identifying that from something else. And so you can extrapolate that beyond just communication, right? Your body itself is a collection of words, a syntactic operator that takes in information from the environment and feeds it to your consciousness in a very protocoled way. And that protocol dictates the things that you can feel. So, in order to be able to sense heat, your body, over the course, your ancestors' bodies, had to identify the utility of sensing heat. And in developing nerve endings to sense that heat, they've actually concocted the word for heat in their physical form itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, anything created has a purpose. That is the whole
Well,
basis of teleology, isn't it?
it
Anything
is, but
created, it has a purpose.
the end result of this line of thinking is that what creates the objective universe is our ability to differentiate order from chaos, and that actively doing that is an act of creation. And so it implies, in something that Langan has proposed in his CTMU, that there's a global telor, namely God, who's the final differentiator. And so in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God, is basically a statement that conscious differentiation of order from chaos is creative, and that's how the universe was created.
Yeah,
So,
I mean,
in
obviously,
order
we
to
won't know
diverge,
what order is until we experience chaos.
correct.
We
So,
won't know what good is until we experience evil, and it's a price we have to pay for the understanding
yes.
of these paired concepts.
but that's kind of where like I sense the most profound things from a philosophical lens lie. There's an elaboration on top of Christ as the Word made flesh, right? That leads you down paths that land in the quantum mechanical realm, and definitely in the fitness function realm with other societies. I'm sorry, other species, um, and it implies evolution, which I don't see that in any other religion, and so I don't see that in any other narrative framework either. The implications mathematically and scientifically from that line of thinking are striking to me as it's onto something, right? And again, if you were to sum up Jesus's primary teaching into one thing, it would be love thy neighbor as thyself, right? Which is a radical concept
It was
because
already in the Old Testament. It's not
it
original.
is, it is. But if you think about the implication, can you think of any character in the Old Testament that actually acted upon that, who loved thy neighbor so much that they prioritized their well-being above their own to the point of death?
Well, Abraham was kind of going to sacrifice Isaac,
His
wasn't
son.
he? Yeah. And then he
Yeah.
was told by a benevolent God that, oh, Abraham, don't
I
worry,
mean,
I would never ask you to do such a thing.
that's
I
close.
don't approve of human sacrifice. But Jesus seems to be reviving that practice again.
I would say that sacrificing your offspring is a very, very close second to self-sacrifice. It may be on an equivalent level, but it's close. It's
But I
close.
think it's a principle of saying, no more human sacrifice is barbaric. It's not necessary. Don't do it
Right.
anymore.
I'm using the term sacrifice not in its literal sense, right? There's a we use that term to talk about how athletes behave, and money in and of itself represents a ledger of sacrifice, so to speak, right? That's how we use it. You gain a notional dollar for sacrificing today, and it's a promise for tomorrow, right? That's what money is. So that's why it's a promissory note, right?
Yes, but really, the sacrifice we're talking about is the postponement of pleasure. So it has been said, going back to the subject of gender relations, is that marriage is a sacrifice.
Yeah.
And it's not some fairy tale rom com where the prince, carries the damsel off into the sunset on his steed. It's a constant, expense, irritation, inconvenience, possible disappointment with your spouse, with your children, if you don't parent them properly or if you don't choose your spouse carefully. So it is a burden, it's a sacrifice. And then additionally in Western culture, that there's a sort of fairy tale, pink and fluffiness put on it, and then inevitably people are disappointed and angry and bitter and reject the whole thing altogether. But this could be corrected, in theory, but only through having an honest and rational discussion about it. But it seems pretty clear that patriarchy would be a sacrifice, a burden on men. Even if we were to bring it back again.
I
Because
don't know
because
if I
really it is a terrible thing to think I'm stuck with this person and I have to have children with them, and what if I get bored and irritated?
I think that for the majority of men, patriarchy is beneficial from the baseline of what they would live out their lives to be in a non-patriarchal system. Agree with you. It's a sacrifice for the majority of women, and it's a sacrifice for the very top men. But I think for the majority of men, it's patriarchy is very beneficial, and
Yes.
it ends up being beneficial for the majority of women in aggregate because society becomes much more cooperative and capable of providing protection and goods from disease and harm, etc. So
Yes, there are utilitarian benefits to patriarchy in a more
yeah,
orderly
and we're
society, a
defining
more
patriarchy as
cooperative
societal
society.
monogamy, correct?
Hmm?
We're defining patriarchy as societally imposed monogamy. right? In the family
Yes,
unit. That's how you're using. Yes. So I
yes,
agree with that wholeheartedly.
yes.
But
And
Claire, it's been about an hour and 45. So
well, thank you for joining me. It's been very productive and very interesting, and I hope we can do it again.
yeah, Claire, it was a nice conversation. I hope I made some sense and illuminated some things, maybe.
You
So,
certainly did. Thank you so. Thank you very much.
Claire, take care.
Okay, you too. Bye bye.